Hey everyone, welcome to session 273 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. I am very much honored to be joined today by Drs. Carol Pilgrim and Tim Hackenberg. Listeners will recognize Tim from his very informative and popular episode on Token Economies. And if you haven't heard that one, I highly recommend that you go back and check it out. It's session 205. And I would also recommend that you read Tim's excellent review paper in JABA on the same topic. Dr. Carol Pilgrim is professor of psychology at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and it would take me several minutes to get through all of her contributions and accomplishments that she's imparted to the field. Here are just a few. Dr. Pilgrim has served as president of its major organizations, including ABAI, as well as its Southeastern ABA chapter, the Society for the Advancement of Behavior Analysis, and Division 25 of the American Psychological Association. She also served as secretary of the Society for the Experimental Analysis of Behavior and as a board member of that organization. And for more details on her quite lengthy resume and accomplishments, go to the show notes for this episode. I'll have a link where you can learn more. As you'll hear in the podcast, Tim and Carol reached out to me to talk about the upcoming conference that they are co-chairing. It's ABAI's 2024 Theory and Philosophy Conference. It's happening on October 28th and 29th. The on-site location is in Chicago, and it will be available virtually. While we did spend some time talking about the conference, we spent the majority of the episode discussing the importance of understanding behavior analysis and its theoretical and philosophical underpinnings, and the importance of understanding these things at a deep level. Specifically, we touched on why these topics are essential to graduate training in behavior analysis. We talked about distinguishing theory and philosophy from concepts and principles. Tim talked about the distinctions between theory and meta-theory, or big and little t theory. We talk about the assumptions that guide the science of behavior and science more generally. And we get into some examples of findings in the basic laboratory that have made their way into everyday practice. In this discussion, we also talk about this process happening in reverse, or happening in this kind of interactive, almost circular manner. And of course, we get into the details about the conference itself, including how it's organized, what the role this conference serves amongst the many training opportunities that exist, and much more. In short, they make their pitch for folks to come check it out. Lastly, one of the topics we touched on that I'd like to return to sometime down the road is the epistemology of behavior analysis, knowing how and why we know what we know, and distinguishing these things from, or these reasons from, other disciplines. And I think that as I talk about, that can help us maybe come to some better understanding, maybe not necessarily agreement, better understanding where practitioners from other settings and backgrounds are coming from. Lastly, for disclosure's sake, ABAI is not sponsoring this content. However, in furthering the goal of being a transparent media outlet, I'm very much open to this possibility. All kidding aside, while this might seem like an eat your vegetables first or I swear you'll use algebra someday type of show, I hope you come away with a broader appreciation of this topic. And I'm grateful that we have folks like Carol and Tim who can organize events like these to showcase them. Today's podcast is brought to you by How to ABA and their Behavior Resource membership. The resource membership saves you time, lends you support, and helps you keep up with your CEUs. It also includes a vibrant community. For more information on How to ABA and their Behavior Resource membership, go to howtoaba.com/join. We're also brought to you by CEUs from yours truly, Behavioral Observations. That's right, you can get your CEUs while driving, walking the dog, doing the dishes, or whatever else you might have going on, all while learning from your favorite podcast guests. We're brought to you by the 2024 Stone Soup Conference. Yep, it's that time of year again. Behavior Analysis premier online event is taking place on October 25th. Come hear from pod faves, including Drs. John Austin, Lena Slim, Jim Moore, and many others. 8.5 learning CEUs are available, and when you use the promo code podcast24, that comes out to less than $8 per credit. So again, go to the show notes to learn more about that. And last but not least, we're brought to you by the Behavioral Toolbox. It's the new education and training site that my colleagues Anika Costa and Dr. Polly Gavoni and I have been working on for the last couple of years. We have 2 courses available. Our first course, Ready, Set, Consult, and our newly released course, When Not to FBA, 5 Quick Strategies for Improving Behavior in Classrooms. Okay, I think that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, please enjoy this episode on theory and philosophy and behavioral analysis with Doctors Pilgrim and Hackenberg.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Doctors Carol Pilgrim and Tim Hackenberg. Thanks for joining me today on the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How's everyone doing?
Great. Good morning.
Very well. Thanks.
We have a lot to talk about, and so I want to start off right away. We're going to be talking about the Theory and Philosophy Conference that's coming up on October 28th and 29th. It's being held in Chicago, and it's being put on by ABAI. It's also available virtually, so let's just get the promo out of the way real quick. But this is an important topic, and I'm glad that you guys are joining me to discuss it. And one of the things I think just right out of the gate I'd like to start out with is talking about, what do we mean when we talk about theory and philosophy, and why are these important things to discuss, particularly when it comes to training individuals in behavior analysis, training students and future practitioners, future scientists, etc.?
That's such a great question. It's hard to even know where to start, and certainly one that I feel very passionately about. If I could take a step back, I may have an unusual path into behavior analysis, but the whole reason I discovered the field was from a philosophy class. That's where I was first introduced to the work of B.F. Skinner. That led me into wanting to study psychology and behavior analysis more specifically. So it's probably some of my own history that makes me feel so strongly about this. I was a freshman double major in philosophy and psychology when I started college and took a course called The Nature of Man, which shows you how long ago this course was, right?
Right.
But in this course, we read books by a number of different philosophers. We were sampling Nietzsche and Sartre and Kierkegaard, and we read Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And it's just like rockets shot out of my head when I read this book. It was the first time I had read something that was such a coherent account of things I was interested in. And the rest, as they say, is history. But with that kind of beginning, I always have wondered why we don't rely on introduction to philosophy as more of an establishing operation to get people hooked on our field. It's usually a piece that comes later in education, right? And in graduate education, but it can really be such an important stepping stone. But to kind of summarize all of that and give Tim a shot, I think the theory and philosophy is, the way I think of it, it's the glue that makes all the rest of what we do hang together. And without it, we just have lots of interesting bits, but they make the most sense and do the most good. They are the most effective when we have that kind of coherent, integrated understanding. And so, in my view, then theory and philosophy needs to be interwoven throughout everything as we learn about behavior analysis and as we engage in behavior analysis and as we practice behavior analysis. So that's just a little starting point of where I'm coming from.
I would love to see that syllabus from that class. That would be amazing to check out, to see Skinner's work juxtaposed with all those, I guess, titans of philosophy. And that's just simply amazing. I don't think I've heard an entry into behavior analysis, quite like that before. So I appreciate you sharing that. So, Tim, do you have some thoughts on this? You want to jump in on that?
First of all, I didn't know that about your history, Carol. That's a really fascinating.
That's really cool. Yeah,
story. It's a fascinating story. I totally agree with what Carol said. I think theory and philosophy are the foundation of our field, and I think too often it gets treated as a separate category. And we got to, in initial part of the course, we'll cover some theory, and then we'll move on to the other stuff. We'll move on to the science, to the basic and applied research. But I like the way that Carol put that, or I like the way you put that, Carol, that it really needs to be intertwined with everything that we do. And sometimes, people might think about theory and philosophy as being irrelevant to their practical everyday concerns. But I think that an understanding of the basic foundational principles allows you to do so much. So you can get pretty far by just following the cookbook. You can follow the procedures, use a DRO here, use a token board here, use, functional communication training here. But what a grounding in the basic principles enables you to do is to derive the procedures and refine the procedures and troubleshoot the procedures, because you have a grasp of the basic principles. So it's a bit like, following a cookbook versus, mastering the foundational skills of cooking. So when you encounter a novel problem, if you know the basic principles, you can break it down. You can decompose it into its elements, and then derive a procedure from that, rather than just following a procedural protocol, something like that. So I like the way that you put that, Carol, that it needs to be intertwined with everything that we do, the science and the application.
Tim, I think that's a good point of having these a solid background in this, creating conditions in which the practitioner has a more flexible and a more expansive repertoire of skills, because they can, see what's going on behind the procedure and, to your point, adapt to novel scenarios. I see this sometimes online where someone will ask, "Hey, does anyone have a paper on, this problem or something like that?" And I'm not disparaging that activity, because I'm glad someone's looking for a paper on something. They're consulting the literature, and at the same time, I think, again, getting back to your point, perhaps folks with a broader background in concepts and principles might be able to abstract some strategies to deal with whatever that problem is with, in addition to looking at what extant literature exists on a particular topic. So that's a point well taken.
It's all the way back to Beowulf and Risley's defining article on applied behavior analysis, right? It's got to be conceptually systematic. So you have to understand the system to see how this piece is mapping on to all kinds of other possibilities, and how this piece can lead to other things. It really, it's been there all along. I think it's just gotten increasingly forgotten in our age of specialization.
Indeed. So I would like to take maybe a step back or two and maybe talk about, I guess what I'm referring to as the process of knowledge production, the epistemology, or the how we know what we know. And maybe you guys can talk about, and I kind of maybe see it as a pipeline. I know sometimes these things are bidirectional. Sometimes someone encounters something in practice and goes back and says, "Oh, we need to, maybe do some research on this." And so I'm not saying this only goes in one direction, but I'm wondering if you guys can spend a minute and talk about, how science in general works in terms of developing, having a philosophy of how the world works, developing a theory, and then going through the latter steps, perhaps up until the point of developing processes, procedures, treatments, etc., in the applied setting.
Go, Tim.
Okay, I'll jump in. That's a big question, Matt. It's a very good question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I asked that, Tim, just because I want to make the, maybe attack the elephant in the room here. And so far, that's 95% of the listeners to this podcast are going to be, master's level practitioners working with kids with autism in clinics and homes, etc. Maybe some school folks here and there, and they're looking and they're hungry for content, whether it's, stuff like this or CEUs or what have you, that's going to help them be more effective with the individuals that they care very deeply about. So having, tying this together, I guess, would be, I think, a valuable exercise. So.
Well, I might start by making a distinction between theory, what I call theory with a small t, and theory with a big T. So theory with a small t is kind of a way of organizing one's facts, observations, evidence, and generating predictions. So it might be a relatively circumscribed area of research, or it could be a massive area of research, like matching theory, behavioral momentum theory, equivalence theory. These are theoretical frameworks for understanding a given domain, a given scientific domain. And these, an important characteristic of a theory in this sense is falsifiability. So if your theory is falsifiable, that is, it's subject to empirical verification, it's a good thing. And you're within the scientific ballpark. If your theory is not falsifiable, it's probably not a very good theory, because it's not something that you can actually directly test and verify. So there are characteristics of theory with a small t, and I think it's important to distinguish that from what I call theory with a big T. This is sometimes called meta theory or meta theoretical assumptions. This gets to sort of the core foundational assumptions that guide work in a particular discipline. And we're not very good at identifying, and by we, I mean not just behavior analysts, I mean we humans who are, trying to make sense of the world. We're not often very good at articulating what our bedrock assumptions are that guide our work, because every viewpoint, every framework is built on certain assumptions, and concepts and the methods and the ideas only make sense in relation to those foundational assumptions. So, for example, in behavior analysis, we're a natural science, and so we share common assumptions with other sciences, with physics, with biology, with chemistry, and so on. And one of those is that we assume that the world is an orderly place. And the job of science is to discover the reasons things happen. And so in behavior analysis, we assume that there is order in the world, and we set about to discover it in our particular ways. But if you come at it with different assumptions, if you assume that there are, magical causes, supernatural causes, then you're not playing by the rules of science. So if you're going to enter the scientific domain, then you have to play by certain rules and adhere to certain assumptions. So we could go on from there and talk about some of the assumptions that guide work in behavior analysis, the fact that, behavior is a subject matter in its own right, and so on. And we can go down the list. But I just wanted to make a distinction, because we're talking a lot about theory. Sometimes we mean theory in a small t sense, like they're empirical generalizations, that are built up around a particular research domain. But those are different than the meta-theoretical assumptions that guide work in all domains of behavior analysis, in experimental analysis of behavior, in applied behavior analysis and practice. These are sometimes unspoken assumptions. We just do what we do, but when you get right down to it, we all share certain assumptions about behavior being the subject matter, where to look for causes, what the goals of a science are, and so on. So I just wanted to make that distinction. And as we move through, we can kind of think about those two different senses of the term theory.
Hi, I'm Shana Gaunt.
And I'm Shira Carpel.
And together we created How to ABA. Are you an ABA professional looking to elevate your practice, connect with like-minded experts, and access top-notch resources? Do you love your work but struggle with feeling overwhelmed, under pressure, and in need of real support? We get it, and we've been there too. As fellow BCBAs, we know how overwhelming it can be to take care of ourselves and the families we support. Introducing the Behavior Resource Membership, your ultimate resource for everything ABA. We created a behavior resource as a way to unite and support fellow ABA professionals so that you can feel confident in the work you love. The Behavior Resource Membership will save you time. While most of your clients need individualized programming, you can still benefit from a template that gives you a great place to start. We offer you support with exclusive access to online community to collaborate with other ABA professionals. Members can also join the monthly live group mentorship sessions and upkeep your continuing education units or your CEUs, gain qualifying certificates for ACE, IBAO, and QABA upon completing some of our 60-plus on-demand recorded CEUs. You'll get access to hundreds of program descriptions and instructions, data sheets, assessment tools, how-to videos, and materials to implement effective ABA programs for all your learners, saving you time and energy so that you can focus on what's most important, the learners. Join thousands of ABA professionals who are already enhancing their skills and improving their client outcomes with the Behavior Resource Membership. Ready to take your practice to the next level? Visit howtoaba.com/join and become a member today. Your journey to a better ABA practice starts here.
I like that meta theory distinction for sure. I remember one time I was taking a graduate course in education, and I was having what I thought was maybe a quibble with the instructor about something, and I made the point that this doesn't make sense to me. I'm not sure there's evidence to support. I can't even remember what it was about. And she's like, well, there are other ways of knowing. And I was like, oh, we're in different, we perceive the world very differently here. When I heard other ways of knowing, it's like, okay, we're not playing by the rules of science here. We're playing by, an additional set of rules. And I don't think I'm, particularly well equipped to,
But how helpful to realize that early on, because I think that a lot of the disagreements and the struggles that we have with the rest of psychology boils down to conflict and foundational assumptions. And I think that if we were more explicit about, not just we in behavior analysis, but everyone, it's more explicit about what their foundational assumptions are, we might be able to get along a little bit better. At least we would understand where the other viewpoint is coming from. And you might not agree with everything that they do, but you can then evaluate the position in relation to how well it coheres with its foundational assumptions. You can say it makes sense given these opening assumptions. And the same with behavior analysis. Maybe, people don't agree with all of it. They might have an issue with free will or, something, but the position then can be evaluated in relation to how well it connects with its basic assumptions.
Yeah, I would say one more reaction I have to that is that, it not only does it make sense in terms of kind of understanding where the rest of psychology is and, what the distinction between behavior analysis is and maybe cognitive psychology, social psychology, et cetera. But, there are a lot of calls for working in interdisciplinary settings. As a school consultant, I'm always working with speech paths and OTs and things like that. And so having an idea of where, one's theoretical foundations are, I think, at least for me, allows me to kind of maybe take things a little less personally, I suppose. It's like, okay, this is this is how someone was trained. And it's again taking the circumstances view, I suppose, in many respects. So that's a good point to make. So again, I'd like to return to the kind of timeline here. So we have, we've got big and little T theory, and which is, perhaps grounded in the philosophy of sorts. And then in terms of where things go from there, how do, I don't know if an example comes to mind that you guys might have of, something being developed in a very theoretical, very abstract, kind of pure research type of setting in the realm of behavior analysis and kind of making its way through research in various formats out to applied practice. Is there an example that comes to mind that you could share with the audience?
Well, I can. This is a little dangerous one for me to tackle because I'm just getting ready to go give a talk somewhere else, and it's kind of on exactly this point. So I'm going to try not to give the whole talk. But I think, and obviously I'm a bit biased here, but I think the work on stimulus equivalence is kind of a case study in the kinds of things that you're talking about, Matt. If you go back to the origins of work on equivalence in Sidman's early studies, he was trying to solve a very practical issue of helping some young men learn to read who had never been able to benefit from all of the kinds of educational approaches that had been attempted. And so Sidman started trying some alternatives that led him to teach with a simple matching arrangement that's commonly used in educational settings, right? What picture does this name go with? And then what word does this name go with? Very painstakingly teaching those skills with differential reinforcement, ended up with a generative phenomenon that could not have been predicted ahead of time. So it was counter to how most people think about the flow from the lab to the bedside, right? He started with a practical issue and by carefully studying it, came up with some new ideas that took him into the more carefully controlled experimental lab to tease it apart, led to the development of small t theory that Tim is talking about, and served as the basis for one of the most vibrant experimental and conceptual and applied sets of analyses that I think we could point to in behavior analysis today. So from those simple beginnings, you get the interactions from practice to application to conceptualizations to experimentation in the lab and back and forth between all of those domains in a very fluid fashion. So I think one disservice we do to ourselves sometimes is to think of this one-way flow. And then sometimes we recognize that, well, it might go the other way, but really that's the intermeshing that we were referring to earlier. I think the strength of our field of behavior analysis is that all of those parts can work together in a really coherent way and inform each other, which gets back to the epistemology issue, right? In trying to identify what is it that convinces us that we're onto something, that we're beginning to understand it, it is when all of those pieces can work together. And you see the same kinds of conceptualizations for this problem work over here for understanding a different set of phenomena that used to seem too complex to try to tackle from a behavior analytic perspective, feeds on itself. So that's my example.
I see. Tim, does something come to mind for you?
I was just going to say that Sidman's work was translational before that was even a word. You know, that the way that it really exemplifies the sort of bidirectional reciprocal interactions between different domains, or things that we think of as different domains of behavior analysis is really remarkable. And I just to echo what Carol said, our field is really unique in this respect, that this is the importance of understanding the basic foundational principles, because we use the same technical vocabulary, whether we're talking about a pigeon pecking keys, in an operant chamber, or a child solving, math problems in a classroom. We use the same basic, contingency analysis. We, drill down to the basic principles, and we can speak then. It allows us to speak across these different domains in a way that I think is really unique to our field. It's a distinctive characteristic.
Regardless of your title, if you are a behavior consultant who is working in or with schools and you are struggling and wondering why your interventions are not producing the desired results, you are not alone. Unfortunately, those tasked with improving behavior in schools are too often left to carry the burden by themselves. You are the behavior person, so you take care of it, is the unsaid mantra. But you can't improve behavior and the associated outcomes by yourself. In fact, creating sustainable improvement in student behavior almost always requires changes in the performance of the educators. I'm Dr. Pauly, and along with my colleagues Anika Costa and Matt Sikoria, we are designing coursework called the Behavioral Toolbox. In it, you will be taught strategies grounded in organizational behavior management for consulting in schools in a way that brings out the best in educators so they can bring out the best in the students they serve. If this sounds exciting, be sure to click on the link in the description to sign up for more information.
So I want to turn to the conference itself. And so you two are the chairs of the conference. Do I have that right? Okay, I've seen some head nodding. Okay, good. All right. So tell me how this conference came to be. And yeah, we'll start there. I've got some other questions, but I'm just curious how this all was dreamed up.
Well, there was a previous theory and philosophy conference that ABA sponsored, and it was just over 10 years ago when that was held. It was in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it was a tremendous success. And a number of us thinking about next actions for ABA said, wow, we hold theory and philosophy to be a cornerstone of our field. And it's been 10 years since we had a specialty conference that focused on theory and philosophy. So it's time. So that was kind of the beginning to scratch that itch that came about. That first theory and philosophy conference used a kind of unique format that Tim and I, in thinking about this one, really wanted to build on and adapt for the current theory and philosophy conference too. They broke all the talks up into, it's not just kind of a random assortment of theory and philosophy topics. They had clusters of talks where two speakers would address a common target issue. And then there was a discussant who worked to kind of not just the typical 10-minute discussion at the end of a symposium, but had their own piece to try to integrate the speaker's thoughts and their own and come up with some conclusions about that cluster. So that's sort of the format that Tim and I thought would be very effective in this new conference as well. And we brainstormed around kind of umbrella themes that we thought would be interesting for the conference and came up with, I think it was Tim's original idea, to tackle behavioral complexity. Certainly an area that we hear more and more about across the sciences currently, and one that's sometimes held up as a bit of a bugaboo for behavior analysis, right? That you guys do fine with rats pressing levers and pigeons pecking keys, but you can't really help us understand this more complicated stuff. That's what people really want to know about, right? That's kind of an old criticism of behavior analysis. Well, of course, behavior analysts have always argued against that kind of view and have taken the position, as Tim was alluding earlier, that we can understand most forms of behavior if we can get to the basic units of behavior, the basic behavior environment relations, and see how they build together and combine to result in more complex phenomena and performances. So that became the overall umbrella for the theme of the conference. Tim, I'm going on and on. You want to jump in?
Oh no, that's a great intro. Yeah, I mean then when it came to filling out the program, we decided, as Carol said, we wanted to build on the really successful structure of the previous conference, and so we knew that we wanted to have thematic clusters with interrelated talks. And once we decided on the overarching theme, we set about to identify particular clusters. And Carol alluded earlier to the fact that this is a topic that's showing up increasingly in all areas of science. And so we wanted to choose a topic, and choosing behavioral complexity, it was one that enabled us to highlight really cutting edge work in our own field, but also to connect to and reach out to other adjacent disciplines. that are, dealing with these same kinds of problems. And so some of the other disciplines that we looked to were evolution, neuroscience, symbolic and verbal processes, cultural systems, computational modeling. These are all areas where complex behavior is viewed as emerging. I should say arising, because emerging has all kinds of, baggage associated with it, that arising from fundamental, simpler, and not simplistic, but simple in the sense of being general and foundational processes. And so we were really excited to fill out the particular clusters. So we have a cluster on evolution and neuroscience. We have a cluster on symbolic and verbal processes. We have a cluster on computational modeling, and including, new work in AI and cultural systems. So one of the things that unites all of these is this sort of what we might call a bottom-up explanatory view. So by that, I mean looking to the foundational processes as a way of understanding things that are, that arise from them, complexity. So we couldn't be more excited about the roster. I mean, we set out sort of within this framework to identify individuals that would, that would work well within this program. And we're just delighted at pretty much everyone. I think everyone that we invited accepted our invitation. And we're just really, really excited about the way that it's all playing out.
It's cool too, because there's the opportunity for interaction between all of the members of each individual cluster, but because there's an umbrella theme across the clusters, and it turns out because of the individuals that are speaking in each cluster, there's a lot of back and forth across clusters, not just within clusters as well. And there'll be plenty of opportunity for audience input. There's also a poster session where I'm really excited. We have over 50 posters on theory and philosophy. So there's really some very creative approaches being taken there. And then a panel discussion on sort of what we're talking about today, the role of theory and philosophy in training programs.
Hey everyone, I just want to take another quick break here and remind you that the 2024 Stone Soup Conference is coming up. It's taking place on October 25th, and it's Behavior Analysis' premier online event. Come hear from podcast favorites, including Drs. John Austin, Lena Slim, Jim Moore, and many, many others. There's 8.5 learning CEUs up for grabs. And when you use the promo code podcast24, that comes out to less than $8 per credit. So in order to learn more, go to the show notes of this episode, or you can go to Behavior Live and just plug in Stone Soup. Google Stone Soup 2024. There are many options. It's very easy to find. And if you're having trouble finding it, just reach out to me. I'll point you in the right direction. The poster session stood out to me as this seemed like a lot of fascinating topics that are going to be presented. And, probably, I don't think my experience is that much different than a lot of other conference goers. Sometimes it's you want to see who's speaking, and the poster is, you kind of walk around and yada, yada, yada. And I was looking at some of these, I'm like, that looks really, really cool. So I'm glad you mentioned the posters.
Yeah, it was, let me, if I could just say, Matt,
please.
When I attended the first conference, the first Theory and Philosophy conference, I thought that the poster session was a bit of an oddity, because I've been conditioned to think about posters in a particular way, as an empirical poster. You've got an intro, you've got a method, you've got your results, and so on. And I thought, how would you pull that off in a Theory and Philosophy conference? But I have to say that it was one of the highlights of the conference. That, there was just a wide range of really stimulating topics and conversations that came out of the poster session. So we decided that we really wanted to replicate that. And as Carol said, we're just delighted with the turnout.
Yeah, there's tons and tons of posters on interesting topics for sure. I was going to ask you who the ideal, audience attendee would be from your perspective, and maybe that answers guided by your experience with the previous Theory and Philosophy conference a decade ago, but who are you, who is the, if you were to kind of characterize what the average attendee would be, what's your avatar, if you will, of the person you either are, you expect to attend or whom you'd like to attend, or, maybe those are two different answers, but I'm just curious who this is geared for and what your expectations are.
Boy, that's a really interesting question, Matt. I hadn't thought about it exactly that way, but I would say, in terms of who I would like to see there, I'd love to see everybody there, all behavior analysts, of course, although that might get a little difficult to handle logistically. But I think it would be wonderful for students to be there and see there will be reflected at this conference, I think, the myriad of ways that theory and philosophy weave their tentacles into all parts of what we do. Even if you look at the posters and the talks, there are some talks that are more practice oriented, that build on the kinds of fundamental conceptualizations that we're talking about. I think it would be also extremely useful for folks who teach courses in theory and philosophy. There are some recent changes ongoing in the requirements for the course requirements for sitting for the BACB exam. There's always been a category of courses called Philosophical Underpinnings, Concepts and Principles. And I think often what a lot of students received was more focus on basic principles, reinforcement, punishment, stimulus control, and not so much on the philosophical underpinnings. But that's being more highlighted now, that there really has to be some behavioral philosophy and what we might think of as more behaviorism courses as part of the curriculum. So a lot of instructors are in the process of needing to shift their syllabi, and they're thinking about how to approach those courses. I think this conference just opens up all kinds of directions that might not have been obvious at first glance, that can be used by instructors to really generate excitement in their students and themselves as they're kind of shifting their coursework. And then, we want everybody to be more involved in. We have a theory and philosophy track at the ABAI, the annual conference, but I don't know, what happens with a lot of folks is that they get so focused on going to the talks that are specifically on the problems that they're working on at the moment, that they may not go to some of the more broad-based conceptual talks. And having a specialized conference on the topic really helps everybody hone in on, oh yeah, here's our roots and here's why we're doing what we're doing. So who will actually be there, I think, will be interesting to see.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/getCEs. One of the things, so you hit on a point there that maybe we can dig a little deeper on, and that is the role of theory and philosophy in graduate training. Can you talk a little bit more about that? One of the things that occurred to me as you were bringing that up is that the number of people, as we've seen grad programs kind of spontaneously, replicate that, there's a larger and larger pool of individuals teaching behavior analysis these days. And so I'm curious if you have other thoughts on maybe some of the challenges in terms of, I think you mentioned one in terms of combining concepts and principles and the theoretical foundations. Are there other challenges or other potential solutions that you would see towards improving the instruction in this particular domain? And either you can, Carol, you can extend your commentary on that. Tim, jump in too, please.
My first thought, and then give Tim a turn. I hearken back to my own graduate training here, I think. So I'm swayed by that. But theory and philosophy, certainly in my graduate curriculum, we had courses that you would right off the bat say that's a theory and philosophy course. But there was not a single course I took in graduate school that did not have theory and philosophy completely enmeshed in everything that we discussed. And we hit on this theme a little earlier, but to separate theory and philosophy as one thing off by itself and not have it integrated into the rest of the pieces of the program is a problem, I think. That's a way we could improve, to move it beyond the single course and say, okay, you've got your dose of theory and philosophy now, to make it more integrated.
Now here's how you do a functional analysis.
That's right. Check that off and move on to the real stuff, right? Yeah, I think that's the single biggest improvement that I would work towards. And frankly, some of the structure of our bureaucratic systems has contributed to that problem. Requirement that there be a single standalone course and that other courses be standalone courses on a particular topic, as opposed to the strategy that ABAI uses for accreditation is to say you need a minimum number of hours, but you can handle those hours across your courses, within multiple courses. There are lots of ways you can approach it creatively. So that's where I would look to making inroads in terms of helping a broader range of behavior analysts appreciate the power of what theory and philosophy adds to what they do.
Got it. Are there, I know we talked about some posters, the poster session is something definitely you guys are looking forward to. Are there specific talks, and I don't want to put you guys in an awkward position of announcing your, perhaps, a favorite or two, but, is there a particular talk that either catches your eye or a talk or two that perhaps would catch the interest of, again, the average listener, perhaps to this podcast as being, closer to their, perhaps helping them in their work setting?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question, Matt. It's a fair question, but I would say all of the talks. I'm looking forward to all of them.
Okay. All right. We've dispensed with that. So let's
pick your
very diplomatic. That's right.
I mean, the way that I look at it is, I don't really want to make any presumptions about your audience and what they might be interested in. But maybe we could just talk about the topics themselves and the speakers themselves to generate some interest. The cluster on evolution and neuroscience features talks by Louise Barrett, who's a comparative psychologist, evolutionary psychologist, who understands Skinner, exceptionally well. And she came at the field of behavior analysis kind of from a different angle, but she just gets it. So she's talking about, she's giving a talk on how we can understand complex cognition in terms of fundamental units. Brian Kangas is also in this cluster, and John Krakauer, who is a prominent cognitive neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins, who has created a bit of a stir in the neuroscience community by arguing the radical point that behavior ought to come first. And if we're trying to understand the neurobiological underpinnings of behavior, then we should not be content with these crude behavioral measures. We should try to understand, we use sophisticated behavioral techniques to try to understand the behavior first before we go about trying to understand some of its biological roots. So these are people that you might not know because they're ones that we have recruited from adjacent disciplines. but they're doing work that fits just hand in glove with a behavioral approach. So moving on from there, we've got a cluster on computational modeling. Now, at first glance, this might seem like something that's sort of dry and arcane, but it includes Jack McDowell, who's done this fascinating work on developing these genetic algorithms, very simple in their composition, but they generate behavior, complex behavior that's so he does this work that out of these genetic algorithms generates behavior that is indistinguishable from behavior of real life organisms. Okay. This is not just a game, though. This tells us something really important about those fundamental units of analysis. If you can create those, I mean, this is kind of goes to the heart of our field. If you want to explain something, you've got to produce it. You've got to arrange the conditions that give rise to it. And so Jack's work is really cutting edge. He's been doing this for maybe 2 decades, and it's getting increasingly more sophisticated. David Cox has expertise in computational modeling and including the new large language models. And he's going to be giving a talk on how we can use these large language models to help us understand verbal behavior and the verbal in the context of the verbal community. I'm going on and on, Carol.
Okay.
I could keep going, or you could jump in and talk about some of the other talks if you like.
So another cluster that might be of particular interest to this audience is focused on verbal processes. And there we have Dave Palmer, who's a name folks may know if they've studied verbal behavior very much, and he will help us understand how basic behavior principles give rise to grammar. And again, bouncing off of what Tim just said, if you can identify what's necessary, then you can help to establish those behaviors where needed. We have taught by Dermot Barnes. There's a name other people will be, again, probably pretty familiar with, who has really, again, increasingly sophisticated ideas about not a strict Skinnerian interpretation of verbal behavior, but more relational frame direction for understanding those processes. And then Francesca Espinoza will be giving a really interesting talk on how the basic principles of behavior help us understand theory of mind, which, helping an individual understand someone else's perspective. And that all can be understood very effectively through basic behavior principles too. And then another really exciting, the fourth cluster is on cultural systems. So we have Sigrid Glenn and Maria Malat, who are, some of our primary contributors to that area, given their most current views on how we get very complicated cultural operations based on understanding behavior-environment relations. And then Ed Wasserman, he's another example of someone from more traditional learning approaches and comparative psychology, understanding the evolution of culture as well. So, and then I would just add, we haven't even talked about our discussants who are going to do the work on synthesizing, and they are all really esteemed scholars and will bring a lot of fun and energy to the topics too, I know.
All right. Well, it sounds like a really, really intellectually stimulating time here. So I know we're coming up on the time we've allotted for our chat here. I want to give you guys the opportunity to make any other remarks, either about the role of theory and philosophy and where it stands as it relates to our, the training of behavior analysts, or its utility in terms of solving some of these problems, or the conference itself. So I'll give you guys the last word.
Well, I was just going to say about the conference. We have, as Carol mentioned, these thematic clusters, and so we fit people into these. But in point of fact, many of the speakers could participate in more than one, if not all of them. And so we chose people that had that would speak to these kind of broad connections. And so this is one of the things that we're very excited about, that even so that people are not going to just stay in their lane and just talk about evolution and neuroscience, or they're going to talk about, verbal and symbolic processes. I mean, take Dave Palmer, for example. Along with John Donahoe, he wrote the book, literally wrote the textbook on learning in complex behavior. And that really exemplified this kind of bottom-up explanatory mode, where you go from simple processes and work your way up to the ladder of complexity. So we're really excited about the sort of interactive nature and the integrative nature reaching across these different areas.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's unique in that respect. And I would just add too, a final dimension we haven't really touched a lot on, but in many ways, you could argue that these themes of behavioral complexity are the future of our field. We hear a lot of discussion about where's behavior analysis going, and, are we too stuck in our current niches? What else can we bring to the world in terms of understanding behavior? And these are exciting, really hot new directions that I think they're far from being completely figured out. People are exploring fun new ideas, and I think that's a great opportunity for students and faculty and scientists alike to benefit from. I never thought about it that way. Here's some new things that we could be doing, right?
Yeah. And there's also a sense in which, this really goes back to the beginning of our field, this approach to understanding complex behavior. And, it's been subject to a lot of misconceptions, as Carol mentioned earlier. But a lot of these areas are sort of catching up with the sort of, explanatory framework that we've been working with for decades. And so, for example, the computational modeling, back in the 80s and early 90s, the field was dominated by this sort of top-down, formal computational models of intelligence, that fit really well with the sort of cognitive psychology of the day. We've got the executive function, you've got the centerpiece, and everything then follows from that. And it's only been over time with, neural networks and most recently artificial intelligence that really embodies this kind of bottom-up approach to understanding. And so now the parallels are obvious, The same thing is happening in neuroscience. Same thing is happening in situated or embodied cognition. These are cognitive folks who recognize the importance of the environment in creating complex behavior. So it's just really exciting.
Yeah.
And cultural evolution. Yes, and cultural evolution. This is something that also is it feels like there's this kind of broad convergence of viewpoints, and it's very exciting for behavior analysis to be situated in the middle of this broader scientific enterprise.
Nice.
All right. Well, I know these types of events don't happen, they don't come out of nowhere, and I imagine that there's a lot of hard work that you guys put into making this event and creating it, curating all the talks and organizing and things like that. So I just want to thank you guys for the hard work of putting this together and having a conference on this topic to kind of present to the community. So thanks for doing that. And I want to wish you guys the very best of luck with the event. And again, that is the Theory and Philosophy Conference, October 28th and 29th, available virtually and also in person in Chicago.
There are discounts for students.
Oh yeah, we should mention that too. Yeah, and I'll be sure to highlight that elsewhere. So, all right, folks, thanks so much for joining me today to talk about this.
Thanks, Matt. Enjoyed
it. Thanks, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.